So the title of today's webinar is The Future of Enterprise Architecture and Innovation. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking through some of the trends, some of the drivers that we're seeing which are impacting the enterprise architecture space, and then offering some kind of position statements, some sort of views which we can be the basis of discussion or further thought, which we can start to build a conversation about how EA evolves over the next 3 to 5 years. So one thing, as an architect, I'm very aware of is that, unlike building architects, unlike architects who build office blocks or stadiums, we are building fundamentally on ground that's continuously moving. And what's driving that movement at the moment is very much technology innovation. And, that seems to be a trend that's accelerating. And it's driving out new trends in delivery. It's driving out new ways of running change in organizations like Agile and Biomodal. So we want to pick up on some of those themes. And this is going to be a panel presentation. So we have multiple panelists who are going to be presenting different aspects of how we think EA is going to evolve. And hopefully that's going to drive a wider conversation about the evolution of EA in the near term. So just a quick couple of introductions before we dive in. A little bit about Avolution, first of all. So many of you will be familiar with us, but for those who aren't, we produce the Abacus enterprise architecture tool, which is widely recognized as one of the leading EA tools. And we support multiple organizations globally, across all sectors, across all regions. And we help them to basically to map and evolve and analyze these complex systems they call their business and their IT architectures. We have a fairly close working relationship with the Open Group, so Abacus is certified for TOGAF and for Archimate. And we also spend a lot of time thinking about how we can support EA practitioners deliver within their particular organizations. Now, I guess because this is partly about innovation, something that's probably important to stress that as Abacus, like many technology companies, actually was born out of a university originally. So our roots are in the University of Technology in Sydney, specifically in the architecture-based engineering group there. And we still have links with that institution, and we still very much try and think about how we can drive innovation into architecture. So I'm going to introduce our panel. Now it looks like we're a man down today, so we might have to make do with just 3 of us. But fundamentally, there are 4 people who have contributed to the content of this deck. So we have Tim, who's the founder of Avolution. Tim's going to be talking about some of the new and emerging technologies that we're seeing as architects and how we start to frame our response to those technologies to drive value in the organization. Now, Stuart, I think, has not been able to join us. I'd be delighted if he is, but we'll look on the basis he's had connectivity issues. Stuart is a CEO of Real IRM. He'll be familiar to many of you because he's closely involved in the Open Group, particularly in South Africa. Stuart's specialty is really understanding the practice of EA, the kind of skills, certifications, and behaviors we need as enterprise architects to actually drive our agendas in the organization. We're delighted to have Dimitris with us from BNP Paribas today. Dimitris is the head of IT enterprise architecture there. And he's, a genuine boots on the ground, highly experienced architect, going out and driving the architecture agenda daily in a large financial services global operation. And Dimitris is going to help us understand really where the EA practice needs to position itself within the enterprise in the near term. And finally, myself, Ed Granger. I'm a consultant with Avolution. I'm also an enterprise architect by training. I've also worked heavily in financial services. And my role here, basically today, is to introduce the topics and then get hastily out of the way and let the other guys do the talking. So this is the agenda we're going to cover. We're going to look quickly at some high-level forces and trends, particularly technology-focused. So we're very much focused on technology trends, but also their business implications. So we're going to look at some of those trends that we see in our client base, which are changing the architecture agenda. We're going to take a quick deep dive into some of those technologies and think about really how we as architects start to approach some of these new and in some cases exotic technologies and land them within the organization. And then we're also going to take a sort of more inward-looking view of EA and really say, how do we as architects and as an architecture practice need to start to evolve how we do architecture in the next 3 to 5 years. So again, as Simon said, please make sure your lines are on mute. If you have any questions, please drop them into the QA window. We will try and respond to those questions as we go. If we don't, we'll try and allow some time at the end to do that. So I'm going to start by looking at some of the forces and trends that we've seen driving the EA agenda. And really, because we need a catchy phrase, we've divided these into what we call the 4 Cs. And the first of those 4 Cs really is the big, trend we're seeing is around cloud. Now, by training, I'm an information architect, and when I first heard about cloud a few years ago, I assumed it was simply a way to provision, cheaper servers. But, I've been educated since then. Cloud is a transformational capability. It's something which is a platform for both technology and business transformation. So it's a huge opportunity we're seeing. But also it carries some significant risks, some commercial risks, potentially regulatory risks, and potentially security risks. So like all these things, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The next big theme we're seeing is around complexity. Now, complexity is bread and butter to architects, but really we're seeing 2 sources of complexity in our emerging business and IT architectures. The first is really complexity driven out from new technologies. So things like the Internet of Things, which drive like a massive increase in the volume and complexity of our information processing. But also we, of course, have our legacy technology and the multiple generations of technology we run our businesses on. And the challenge, as ever, is to deliver seamless customer experience and operations on the back of that kind of, that stack, that legacy stack. In terms of connectivity and openness, I think it's now well accepted that the organization doesn't exist between 4 walls anymore. It's part of an extended ecosystem. And of course, that puts a lot of demand on the architecture in terms of things like, openness, open standards, and integration. But it also poses some significant risks, as we all know. Things like cybersecurity have now come to the top of the agenda as more and more we find that we can't necessarily keep the malicious people who would want to disrupt our operations outside the castle walls, as it were. But probably the biggest one, I guess the big theme that's going to come out of this one, is really about the convergence, the way that business and IT are starting to come together. And this is partly because, technology is so now well embedded in business operations that the business want to wrap their arms around it. But I think it's also because fundamentally more and more technology is becoming part of the proposition. Whether you work in business or public sector, the services we offer out are becoming more and more technology-centric. So really the dividing line between the business and between the IT department is becoming well and truly blurred.
Ed, sorry to interrupt here. It's Tim here. We can hear you fine. We've actually got a question already from the audience that's relevant to that last slide. So
yes,
I'm happy to throw it in there. And I think you said at the start as well, everyone. We've set this up as a bit of a panel session, as a bit of a Q&A. So we certainly encourage everyone to submit your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try my best to keep up with them and pose them just like this. So Ed, we've got a question already from a UN Mac who asks, do you define complexity by the amount of data as one dimension? So I know you have a good understanding of how you define complexity. So do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, so I think, one of the models we use for complexity, particularly in the kind of world of emerging technology, is really the Gartner definition of big data, which is the 3 V's model. So the volume, the velocity, and the variability of the information. So the amount of data, yes, absolutely, is the volume of information coming in. The velocity is the rate at which it's coming in, and the variability is the heterogeneity or the extent to which that information is in different formats or have different meanings, within that data set. So that's a very information-based view of the world. But I think fundamentally you can apply that to other domains as well. So if we're thinking about, the Internet of Things, the volume of devices, the rapidity with which those devices are transmitting information, and the variability of devices we're going to have, that 3 V's model kind of applies across the different architecture stacks or different architecture domains, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Good. So really we see EA as being kind of the linchpin of this kind of convergence of the enterprise and the information technology agendas. And I think, the mission of EA is going to become really one of assurance, combined assurance that, both the the corporate agenda and the IT agenda can be delivered, in a way which is consistent and drives towards a set of organizational outcomes.
Could I comment on that?
Of course, yes.
Just going back to the previous slide.
Yep, go for it.
So, it's really, to me, enterprise architecture is really going to remain a bit of a theoretical and academic exercise unless it's anchored into the organization using governance. So if you just move down to the next slide, please. So it's really enterprise architecture as the linchpin between corporate and IT governance, driving that fusion between business and technology, where basically the corporate governance would be things like Sarbanes-Oxley, and in South Africa we've some leading governance frameworks, although not applied as well as they should be, King 3 and King 4, which is a corporate governance requirement. And the opportunity is really to find the control points between corporate governance and IT governance using, for example, COBIT as a standard. And I think that's one way to embed enterprise architecture into the organization, driving towards performance management, where it's the alignment or the total organizational alignment from vision all the way through mission, values, goals, right down to metrics, which is obviously a key touch point. And from a knowledge management perspective, that's really converting personal tacit knowledge into organizational knowledge and putting those who know and those who need to know together. And I think enterprise architecture has a key role to play within knowledge coordination. If we are, for example, applying frameworks to link people to process, to role, to risk, etc., and making that information available, we are really driving towards that fusion between business and technology. And I think with the new developments that enterprise architecture is being placed on the board as a board agenda item. So I think we're really living in exciting times where enterprise architecture can really add significant value. If you want to move on then, Ed. Back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very glad you're with us, Stuart, as well. So thank you very much for that. So, in terms of which technologies we're talking about, I mean, it's, from Avolution's point of view, it's not our job to kind of to tell you which technologies you should be paying attention to, but many of you will be familiar with analysts like Gartner and Forrester, and they will provide very good view of, what should be on the radar, not just kind of what's coming towards you, but also how fast it's coming, what its level of impact is going to be. But it's very important for architects we have that view of, what's just coming over the hill. So what's the emerging trends? I think equally important, though, and this can be a bit of a thankless role, but, experienced architects and technologists will recognize it very well, that sometimes we have to be the guys who damp down the excitement a little bit. We have to be the responsible adults in the room, so the ones who aren't dazzled by the future, because our role fundamentally is to kind of embed these technologies into the organization and to understand how they're actually going to drive organizational value. So it's very important that we have a slightly dispassionate, a slightly kind of more, we're standing back and looking at these technologies in the organizational context. So let's actually jump in and look at some specific technologies. So we've referenced a few. We're going to take a deep dive on a couple. So in terms of the technologies that we think are kind of jumping out, a material or driving the EA agenda at the moment, we really have two categories. We have the stuff that's kind of with us right now, so things like open APIs or mobile or cloud. Now, we put these on here because a lot of organizations we're seeing are actually well into their journeys with these technologies, but in some cases they're still figuring out either how to operationalize them or how to embed them as mature capabilities or how to monetize them or realize value from a customer standpoint or a stakeholder standpoint from them. So I guess what I'm saying is that in many cases people are in these journeys, but the journey is not complete. But unfortunately, the future doesn't wait for anyone, and we have the next generation of technology that's already coming over the hill. It's already, in some cases, in organizations being prototyped, the subject to POC. So I'm talking about things like artificial intelligence, machine learning here, the Internet of Things, digital twins. So as architects, we have to figure out what our response to these things is going to be. And at this point, Tim, I'm going to bring you in because I know you've done a lot of thinking about fundamentally how architects kind of assimilate these new technologies into the enterprise?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ed. So I guess you were probably too polite on the quote a couple of slides ago, which was the teenage sex analogy. So no, that's okay. I'll read it out, Ed. Don't worry. Basically, the thing that everyone needs to appreciate, and as Ed sort of alluded to here, is and indeed even inherent in something like a Gartner hype cycle, there is some sort of excitement phase, right? And everyone thinks it's cool and it's hot, and we all need to jump on board, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's happening. So this is the teenage sex quote. Just because everyone's talking about it, no one really knows what it is. Everyone thinks everyone else must be doing it, so everyone basically says they are doing it. Now, the reality may not, of course, be the same as that. So Ed, if you want to go back to the slide about the different technologies that are coming down the pipe in a sort of, this one, so in a certainly longer term. We picked a couple, so we're going to talk about AI, machine learning, Internet of Things. The whole digital twin topic, this is something that's in Gartner's 10 trends to keep an eye on. It's a really good piece of work if you get a chance to have a look at it. It has more application in sort of the physical world, so it implies a lot more about building a digital model of something that's physical, be it a pump or an engine or something in the sort of manufacturing world, or being at a customer experience lab or something where people can kind of immerse themselves in some future retail experience. We think there is application, though, for this metaphor or this concept of digital twins to the entire enterprise architecture way of thinking, in so much as your enterprise architecture repository, or however you see that, the way that you describe your business digitally, which is essentially what needs to be done if you're going to call yourself a digital business, that could be thought of as your digital twin. And the whole point being is you've got a virtual model of your own business that you can then run experimentations on. As macabre as that may sound, that's kind of the idea of these things, is being able to road test things and test different scenarios against them. So EA itself fundamentally fits to that digital twin model, we think. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on that anymore. I will talk about these first two here, this AI and Internet of Things. So so Ed, if you want to take me to the next slide. And I'd remind everyone again, we encourage you to ask your questions along the way. So I'm going to sort of pose some questions here. You guys, if you can read fast, you can start to see some of them there. So I'm kind of keen to already hear what some of the audience thinks about this. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's many hundreds of people here. So I think between the many hundreds of you, there'll be some pretty good, interesting perspectives. And so I'm keen to have those submitted. I'm happy to table them, put them to the panel, including myself and Demetrius, Stewart, and Ed to respond to as well. So a little bit of a position statement, though, I'll put in there. So by all means, put your questions in now. Internet of Things. It's clearly something that has a lot of hype around it. If you looked at the hype cycle, indeed, from Gartner, they've got that right at the top of the curve, right at the I can't remember what it's called, maximum something or other, hype. And before we necessarily enter towards some trough of disillusionment, we're going to have a go at trying to see how relevant this might be in our enterprises over the next couple of years. We already know in some industry segments it's happening, right? So definitely, smart metering, of course, is happening here in the UK. Most of you will know that there's a mandate to move to that over the next, I think it's maybe even only 2 years. A lot of the manufacturing industries, airports, things like that, they have all of these different sensors around. So this is happening. I remember hearing many years ago, I'm going to say even more than 10 years ago, I was talking to some architects working it's called the Australian Agricultural Company. It's a large landholder in Australia. They have a lot of pastoral land with crops and livestock. One of their projects they had there was an olive grove with 1 million olive trees in it. And every one of those trees had a microclimate sensor on it. Literally every tree. So it was measuring, various KPIs around, the nitrogen levels in the soil and the oxygen at the tree and the temperature and the pressure and all that kind of stuff. All of that stuff was being fed once per hour. So this is 1 million trees, once per hour to a central center where they were monitoring the environment, deciding what irrigation needed to be done, what fertilizing needed to be done. So that volume of information is just staggering. Okay, so some of the challenges you're going to have with this Internet of Things, as we're being asked as architects to, dare I say, design for this, are going to be pretty, significant. So first and foremost, you can see those bars on the right there in the survey there, the implications from a storage point of view. If you've got this volume of information, is this kind of like big data's natural evolution? Is this where we're basically being asked to store and process huge quantities? There was terabytes of data involved in that olive grove example. So is that going to be the biggest challenge for us as architects, is to provision some obviously some phenomenal storage capabilities, and then the accessibility of that storage? By pushing essentially our architecture right out to the edge. We're pushing it right out to the into the customer premises. That's a telecommunications metaphor. Right out to the access leg, right into people's homes, or onto every tree. I'm glad to see you, Joel. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to hug those trees as well. Needless to say, is being able to access all that stuff in real time. So this is the whole data analysis side of things. Being able to make sense of all that digital information, or are we just going to die? Literally taking the metaphor to its conclusion. The forest for the trees. Will we be able to find any intelligence from that, or are we just going to be dying in some data swamp? That's certainly a consideration for us as architects. As we embrace IoT, you start getting into all of the topics around interoperability and openness, and as we all know, the open groups, mission statement, all that is the open interchange of information. So fundamentally, we have a role to play in how the standards around this might play. Okay, so it's a pretty early days. There are a couple of IEEE standard working groups that are in play. There's, of course, all the de facto ones out there. So most of you probably know about, Apple's HomeKit, and Google Home, Amazon Echo, all that stuff. So in the consumer space, of course, there's a lot of work being done, and who knows which one will win. But in the enterprise space, there's still a lot of work to be done about how can this stuff interoperate. What sort of roles does someone like the Open Group have to play in that? In this open, interoperability of things. So really, like I say, I just want to sort of pose some of those challenges out there, and obviously you've got the questions here in front of us. So anyone in the audience who's got a sort of feedback, absolutely drop those in there. The other thing, again, as we head to the, dare I say, hopefully not the trough of disillusionment, there's a quote there in the middle right which talks about, back in 2016, 15% of people said they had no immediate plans for IoT, and that actually went up this year. So, is it the teenage sex thing? Is everyone talking about it? But, really, I don't think necessarily anyone's going to do anything about it. So, what is the future hold for this IoT in the enterprise space? Not too sure. Okay, next slide, Ed. So the next technology that we clearly see is coming down the pipe is the, as we all know, it's already there, as Ed alluded to, there's already pilots and all this kind of stuff going on, is all around artificial intelligence, machine learning. So, the concept of smart machines out there, doing some good work, hopefully providing some insights that you otherwise wouldn't get from your human intelligence. Now, that's the first kind of qualifier on this. When we sort of see this certainly as, I don't know if I want to use the word siloed, but it's a bit more specific. So there'll be certain problems that absolutely lend themselves well to an AI approach, whether it's, new algorithms for, setting, premium levels for insurance policies, so, ratings engines and things like that, whether it's, image recognition and, and all that kind of stuff in airports, sort of smart IDing of people. Those of you who were at the Open Group event in Amsterdam last week we had the chief architect from Schiphol Airport come in, and he talked about this ability to basically understand a person and, a passenger, and for their whole journey through the entire airport. So, from the moment they, dare I say, get out of their cab, jump into the check-in, and then all the way through to the gate. So, having that single understanding of a person through the whole journey, so, the customer's journey through the entire airport, being well understood, using image recognition and different things to, and smart prediction of where, people go to, and all the kind of, algorithms that are associated with that. But fundamentally these things are sort of, again, I don't know if I want to say siloed, but are in sort of some specific markets. Okay, so I don't think necessarily there's going to be the overall, we don't have to be too fearful of our jobs. There's not going to be you're not going to have AI doing an architect's job. AI is going to be sitting in some niche areas, whether it's doing, customer, relationship stuff with, understanding, business moments and things like that. or like I say, ratings engines and things like that for your insurance companies. But yeah, it's not likely to be at the holistic level where AI starts to say how you can make your business better. Per se, at the macro level. Of course, at the micro level, it can look for better opportunities for for doing things, but certainly not at the macro level. We don't think. Now, the other big caveat around AI is fundamentally this kind of black box side of things. So again, I'm not too sure what your background is and how you came here to be an architect, but one of the things that we found is usually I don't know, a prerequisite, and hopefully, Stuart, if you're still on the line, we'll talk about some more when it comes to the people that make good architects. They need to be people we've seen who fundamentally think deterministically or empirically, and they think cause and effect, and they think decompositionally. You can break a problem down into its parts and solve the parts. An architect tends to think that the whole is greater than the parts, right? So that's the old tenet of architecture, is the Gestalt way of thinking. So certainly there are emergent properties. There are things that emerge out of the parts that you wouldn't otherwise have from the individual parts themselves. Okay, so that way of thinking, that deterministic structural way of thinking, is actually a little bit at odds to the traditional AI way of thinking, which is very much black box. Okay, so AI thinking fundamentally, if you're talking neural networks and feedback neural networks and things like that, you feed it some training data, you let it, process that and learn over time, and eventually it starts, spitting out answers that are hopefully correct, and then you obviously offer it new data that you've never sent it before, and it hopefully gives you the right answer. Okay, so that as an approach is a bit difficult for us as architects, because we kind of have to throw our hands up a little bit. We do ultimately have to sort of say, look, I can train this thing, and I can work out how to give it enough storage and enough compute power, but beyond that, I can't really do too much as an architect. So certainly we're going to be asked as architects to do this stuff, but we have to really understand where our dare I say skill set finishes. So Ed, do you want to jump to the next slide? So this elaborates on that challenge. So again, you're going to be asked these questions as an architect over the next X numbers of years if you haven't already been asked these things. So essentially, people are going to come to us and say, hey, we hear about the school AI stuff. Can you guys go and dig out some training set for us? Okay, that's going to be an interesting challenge for us, is gathering data out of your either out of your existing data, or try to run some experiments, or do some surveys and gather some things, maybe purchasing some data. These are things that we may be being asked to do as architects to feed the AI. I don't want to say beast, but the AI black box, let's say. So yeah, I mean essentially. Going through that process and then starting to roll it out, let's assume we do have some success in some area in our business, so we have some ratings engine, or we have some business moments, kind of optimizer. People are going to want us to just say, okay, great, we've got our platform, clearly we've got our our AI pattern or our AI service ready to go. Can we just point that at some other problems? So it's not going to be that simple. So certainly, even when you have success in one division, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to just retrofit that to somewhere else. The training data is different. The neural nets form differently. Again, that black box thing from a regulation point of view, and there's a real challenge here around privacy. And I know, Ed, you're going to have some comments on this, but I'll just sort of pose the challenge as, with GDPR coming, and this obligation for us as providers, as owners of, custodians of information about things. We have a duty to disclose that if it's requested. And so while GDPR, of course, is reasonably clear about us, giving some of the information we might know about a customer, their age, whatever it is, their gender and things like that, it gets a bit murky when you start talking about black box things that we don't really know what's inside. So, I mean, Ed, do you have something to add to that about dare I say, how much we're allowed to peel back the covers or are obliged to? Yeah.
No, I think I won't dive further into that particular thing, but I think there is going to be increasing tension, as you say, Tim, between the need for transparency for regulatory purposes and the increasing, the increasing level to which we're putting stuff into a black box, and we simply don't understand what's happening in there. So I think from an audit point of view, that definitely is going to be an area where we either have to set some expectations, or we at some level have to get into that black box and understand what it's doing.
Yep. No, excellent. And so, needless to say, no one knows. No one even knows how enforced GDPR is going to be come, what is it, March next year? When is it, Ed? What's the supposed date?
May, I believe.
May, yeah, exactly. So yeah, these are unknowns. I mean, we're obviously going to be storing vast amounts of information about people. We're going to be transforming that information through algorithms. AI is going to be obfuscating a lot of that. So does that get us a get out of jail free card? I don't know. So that's obviously something, though, that's going to have to be crossed over the next 6 months. And the risks, the fundamental risks now is, I don't know if I have to be too pessimistic about this, but, who do you blame when things go wrong? Who can you blame? Is it the people who trained the AI system? I don't know. Where does the liability land? No one really knows this now. I'm sure the insurance companies are having some fun with their professional indemnity, policies these days. But where does the liability, rest? If you're going to do all this AI stuff, can we blame the machine? And I know that I think a chimp has now been recognised as a person. We've seen all these different things. I think Saudi Arabia has just recognised a robot as a person. So where does the liability land? That's all unknown. All right, so yep, absolutely. Next slide, Ed. The last thing, and it sort of feeds into those previous two, really, as much as we're talking about innovation and we're talking about these hype cycles, all this cool stuff that's coming down the pipe, the fact of the matter is, there is, and I think, there is bottom right-hand side there, and that's a pretty recent stat, so, lies and statistics, but essentially we're talking about, 80% potentially of banks are spending it on legacy stuff, 92%, so 92 of the 100 largest banks still rely on mainframes, right? So there is a huge legacy of technology in these organizations, and unless we embrace, I don't know if that's the right word, but the concept that we are going to need to be bimodal, right? So there is going to need to be, and already many companies are, half of the, some part of their business is fundamentally about managing this sort of thing, this longer term, longer range, more predictable, more analyzable, it's not the right word, but, being able to do all of the traditional, analytics approaches to them, to, be deterministic and think about roadmaps and decommissioning strategies and all this kind of stuff. There is a whole other side, of course, which is the innovation side, and those things will have to coexist. Some industries lend themselves more to innovation, but certainly other industries are perfectly fine with keeping legacy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality, right? So fundamentally, we need to be sympathetic to the bits that are, dare I say, ripe for innovation, and the bits that are perfectly fine as they are. So we used to refer to that as domain-specific openness, which parts need to be relevant to evolve and change, and which parts don't really need to be. If you've got an old legacy system that's working perfectly well, and it, aside from the how many Fortran programmers you might have on the staff, it's okay. You don't be overly engineered or overly innovative just for the sake of it. I would certainly apply the innovative approaches and embrace the technological curveballs in the areas that are going to make a difference to you. Yep, that's really it, Ed. So obviously I'll pass back to you now for the next set of topics.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. So, I mean, it's a very, very quick and a very small sample of some of the technologies that we're going to have to be planning around, strategizing for as EAs. We could do a lot more on that, but I think it's equally important that we actually turn inwards and look at ourselves as enterprise architects and as enterprise architects' teams and practices, and ask how we need to evolve ourselves in the next 3, 5, 10 years. So I think that's really on kind of 3 levels: the old people, process, technology, possibly triage, possibly or triad, I should say, possibly applies. We need to think about us as architects. What kind of skills do we need? What kind of certifications? What kind of qualifications do we need to do architecture in the near future? We also need to think about our architecture teams and processes and how those are landed in the organizational context at a time when that organization is changing and is evolving and the balance of power is evolving. And finally, I think this is something that we're quite bad at as architects often. We need to think about how we apply some of these technologies to our own practices. So how we use new technology to drive the enterprise architecture agenda. So I'm going to pick up on the first of those, and in fact, I'm going to ask Stuart, again, really to talk about the people aspect. So in terms of skills, certifications, behaviors, Stuart, do you want to just talk about how we as architects are going to need to skill up in the near future?
Yeah, certainly, Ed. I think one of the key aspects is running the enterprise architecture practice like a business. In other words, at essence, it needs to add more value than it costs, or else you simply won't be around for long. So it's really addressing the actual culture within the enterprise architecture team, where that focus on delivering value and actually understanding where the value is and who the customer is. So aspects like stakeholder analysis and understanding who the customers are, what your offerings are, what are your architectural work products. But it goes beyond that, in that there is really a business model that needs to be applied within the enterprise architecture functional practice, where the team understands what they need to do in order to enhance their market reputation or their reputation within the business, how they win better projects, how they deliver valued solutions, how they grow their capability. And people fit directly into that grow our capability type of aspect of the business model within an EA function. So it really looks at recruiting the right people. Often what happens is that the EA function, people get allocated to the EA function without having the right skill set or innate abilities. So in other words, the chief architect needs to be very selective as to who's added to the team, that their psychometrics and their profile fits what's needed. And to me, that what's needed is to manage that skill set and the people as a portfolio, so that you understand and have a very clear definition of your roles within the EA practice, who does what one of the accountabilities, and understanding where you need to grow, as you would any financial portfolio. So
Stuart,
and also,
sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, it's Tim here. Do you want us to ask questions, or are you? Sorry, did you?
I'm happy to. I'm just going to get into education, and if you want.
No, that's fine. So
go for it.
No, I know you talked about psychometric, or you mentioned psychometric testing and stuff like that. Is there? And this is why I'm happy to ask the open question. Have you seen a certain type of personality or something like that has proven to be a better enterprise architect than other?
Well, psychometrically, the Myers-Briggs, the INTJs and the INTPs are probably a good fit.
Interesting.
I think the discussion around the EA function, specifically the people side, could be a discussion that could take a couple of hours. So I'm just really going to cut in on the more important aspects, unless there's specific questions.
No, go for it.
Fine. So it's defining the accountability via the RACI and the RASCI, and as Ed was saying earlier, that we need to eat our own dog food. That we really, if we can't apply the enterprise architecture discipline within our functions and practices, how can we expect our customers to do so, or our organization? So the actual being able to lead by example is key. In growing the education, I think the objective should really be understanding the road, the path from entrant to professional. That there's a very clear growth path, and that it's aligned to the individual's domain of interest and passion. Because there's nothing worse than trying to get a square peg into a round hole. And the opportunities within the EA function are pretty wide and diverse. Specifically, as we start focusing more on the business architecture domain or the information architecture domains. So the skill set and the aptitudes and the way of working also differs across the architectural domains. For example, a technical architect would have a different focus to a business architect who'd be more engaged with the business sponsors. So, as we move up the stack from technology through applications to data to information to business, the actual way of working as well as the way of engaging with the business is different. Are there any questions at that point, Tim?
Yeah, the one question is people are curious about, you mentioned Myers-Briggs, and they heard you say either INTJ or ENTJ or ENTP. What were the ones you mentioned again? Sorry?
INTJ and INTP.
So
I'll have to ask a psychologist to explain that to you, though. But,
yeah, that's fine. I know Myers-Briggs. My mother was a special ed teacher. I know that.
You obviously need your extroverts as well. Some of the E's, because of the fact that the chief architect often needs to engage the business. He needs to be able to enhance the reputation of the function and actually communicate the value proposition. So,
absolutely.
At essence, it's really running the architecture function like a business. In other words, a very clear understanding of your stakeholders. What is your value proposition? What are your architecture work products? What skills are required to deliver those products? And making sure that the architecture function doesn't become too inwardly focused, because I think it's one of the biggest reasons for the failing of architecture practices is that architects become too enamored with the discipline of architecture, rather, where they kind of lose focus, and instead should really have a more pragmatic, customer-focused view. In other words, how to add value, not only from a strategic perspective, but also from a more immediate type of role.
No, that's great.
That's great. Yeah, and I'm kind of. I really want to bring Demetrius in on this point as well, because Demetrius, I know this is an area you've been particularly focused on in terms of. I mean, you lead a dynamic architecture practice within a large organization. You must be kind of aware of the shifting tides of influence within that organization, and have given considerable thought to how you evolve your team. So do you want to talk us through some of your thinking on how really the role of and positioning the EA function is going to evolve in the next few years?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And all along, I thought I was just invited along because I'd survived enterprise architecture for the last 10 or 12 years. And I mean, there's so many good points that have been raised, and very eloquently as well. And I think we could probably spend hours talking about some of these things. Stuart raises some very good points about the sort of people that succeed in enterprise architecture as a practice rather than as an individual. I think, in my view, it's more a multidisciplined team being able to address different aspects of the enterprise, talking the language of business architecture, business process modeling, business process architecture, all the way down to technology. And yes, I mean, again, the volume, the velocity of change, the slide that we've got in front of us is trying to just draw some of those key points out again. We're seeing the continuance of legacy IT. We don't have mainframes in the part of the bank that I work in, but certainly in retail banking, mainframes still exist. So we're trying to deal with legacy IT. We're dealing with changing dynamics across the business, BizPOC, MVP, the need for much more agile practices, appropriate levels of governance. I mean, my role is around enterprise architecture, the modeling, the tooling, the content, as well as the governance of that. And the governance, I think, is one of the key aspects or areas of interest. I think Stuart made an observation previously as well, as this sort of convergence of this meeting together of corporate governance and sort of IT and architecture governance. I think that's key to succeeding. So much faster change. I've really just picked up and borrowed from Gartner the pace-layered architecture, which I think quite well demonstrates for us this kind of these different layers of architecture with different needs in terms of governance. And I think the one comment to make is that we can't accept the status quo. I think the mistake we probably make is if we think we can reach a steady state, then we're very badly mistaken. So I think we have to continually analyze what we're trying to do, whether it meets the business needs and concerns, whether we're speaking the language that people care about, whether we're on the money as in terms of the main topics of conversation for the different stakeholders. So stakeholder management comes into that. But if we had to ask ourselves a few simple questions at a high level, would be something like, how do we make sure innovation works across business and IT? How do we reduce time to market, cost, risk for introducing new applications, API services? How do we break down silos? Those are questions we ask ourselves. We do it internally, reassess our governance and reassess many aspects of what we're doing. Skills and people would come into that as well. I'll pick up on some of those on the next slide. In fact, if we just move on for the moment. I think in the interest of time, I'll try and be relatively quick. So enterprise architecture and IT in general is moving swiftly away from building monoliths. So there's it's stretching the metaphor slightly, but there's the Cologne Cathedral. It took something like 640 years to build and complete, when the business really wants something which is more modular, agile, and there's a house built out of shipping containers. So the ground is shifting underneath us really, really quickly. The one thing about architects is we like to have control. We like to think in a structured way. We like to document everything. We want to do and spend time doing the analysis that's required before we make decisions and put proposals forward. The difficulty is that needs to happen at a far quicker rate and pace than it has ever before. In terms of organization, I'd make just a few comments. I think it's a perennial question, right? Who should EAs report to? I think in most cases it's still the CIO, probably because of the fact that we have architecture in the name. My personal opinion is it doesn't really matter where you report. You need buy-in and sponsorship from the right level of people. And if you can't actually get out and negotiate and influence wherever you report, and obviously there's some level of reporting seniority required to give you access to CXOs. But if you lack the basic skills, then it really doesn't matter who you report to. So I think the skills aspect is key. Architects typically are quite good on the technical elements, so very good on modeling, analysis, often very weak when it comes to the softer skills. In fact, I've focused in my recruitment in recent years looking at people who have the softer skills required to really be effective. So I've mentioned sort of multidiscipline teams. I really have a lot of sympathy for EA practices where they have like one or two people. It's very difficult. The domains, so many specializations within the world of enterprise architecture. I think you need critical mass. I know it's difficult in smaller organizations to have that critical mass, but I think it's really important to think about that as well. I definitely see it as a centralized function. I believe in federation. I believe you need to tap into the expertise of the experts, whether they are functional, sort of information, business, technical. So I very strongly believe in federation and making sure that people in the organization buy in and are accountable as well to some degree. I wouldn't call it full democratization, I don't think, but I would call it a degree of federation. We talk about the EA being a hybrid discipline of engineering practices and disciplines as well as the politics. Politics are changing very quickly. It's amazing how many let's call them EA deals or things are agreed on the Eurostar between London and Paris. You just have to be sitting at the right table or the right seat with the right person to have a quick conversation and make huge progress. Sometimes much more difficult to make in bigger forums or more structured forums. There's always emerging, there's always new stakeholders in the game. So there's the emergence of the Chief Digital Officer. My view on that is, identify them. They need as much support in the early days as they can get to launch their own missions. So it's a perfect time to come alongside, understand their needs, and then work collaboratively with them. I see a few questions coming. Tim, do we want to pause quickly and just pick up on any of them?
Yeah, good on you for mentioning that, Demetrius. I have been keeping an eye on these. There's like over 60 questions, so I kind of made the decision a while ago that it was pretty difficult to take them live. So apologies for that. I saw everyone firing them in there, and I was like, oh, okay, if I take all these, it's going to certainly go off the rails a bit. But absolutely, I'm happy to pose a couple now for certainly you and Stuart, because they are relevant to obviously what both of you guys are talking about. We do have time, of course. I'm going to sort of cut short my bit at the end. I'm probably going to sort of talk about technology a bit more at the end, but I don't think there's any need to do that because these questions are pretty good, and I'm keen to get you guys to offer your expert opinion. So here's one for certainly both you guys, Stuart and Demetrius. So it comes from Ethan Pack, and it's kind of in the PESTLE way of thinking. So, wouldn't political skills, much like stakeholder analysis, selling, marketing skills, communication, operational awareness, and business and financial orientation be part of the future skills list? So that's the broader question about, do people need to do an MBA? Do people need to do, kind of Toastmaster courses to know how to present? What do you guys see as the, are you an arbitrator? Are you a negotiator? What is the sort of skill set, if you're going to be a successful EA?
Well, I could have a go first, and Stuart can jump in as well. Our group architecture function have actually coincidentally have focused very heavily. So they maintain and build and have designed the meta model that we use internally, and the processes and governance that's applied sort of loosely across the organization. But again, they've recognized the need for that sort of training and those sorts of skills. So yes, I think it's important. I'm not sure to what degree it needs to be formalized, but presentation skills, absolutely key. The ability to produce, to construct a good argument, to present it well is critical. I think it's also a question of attitude. I think if you're hiring the right sort of people, and this is the point Stuart made, it makes the job an awful lot easier. If you take a developer whose only job has been to sit in a bunker for 20 years working on C, and then you're moving up into architecture team, which happens a lot. It's seen as a natural sort of progression. Some of them will just never fit, so you need to be much more selective about the people you bring into the team.
Stuart?
I think one of the key aspects is around organizational change leadership or management. Because a lot of the initiatives fail simply because of the fact that the fuzzy people aspects aren't addressed. And I like the use of John Cotter's work, his 8-step change leadership method. And we've done a lot of work over the years, linking Cotter's work to the establishment and running of a business appropriate and sustainable enterprise architecture function. So, that kind of creates a framework. And I think, to also, address other aspects around culture, and, something which is, obviously forms part of TOGAF, when you set the principles. So that the principles are there, but I think what we're missing in the way we manage enterprise architecture principles is that we need to add another section. So we've got the name, the statement, the rationale, the implications, etc. But on the flip side of the page, there should be how to make it actionable. So addressing the change requirements. So in other words, who is the champion of this particular principle? As a team, what do we need to stop doing, start doing, and continue doing? And link that to the accountability matrices and performance management in the team. So I'm really the hard skills are easy to learn. You Archimate and that type of stuff. Going through the TOGAF. It's really how to apply it, given the complexity of an organization. And I don't think it's an MBA. I think it's a combination of that roadmap that is tailored to an individual. That roadmap from entrant to professional, where things like OpenCA, Open Certified Architect, would make a lot of sense. So, I think going forward into the future, the education needs to be structured around the specific growth of an individual, where it's not a 2-year type of time frame, where it's more like 10 years, where both the soft and the hard skills are addressed.
Yep. So I'm going to, Demetrius, apologies. I'll make it up to you later, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. There's various master's programs out there. Like, my university has a master's in EA. There's various ones here in the UK, and I know there's ones in the US, UPenn, and stuff like that. So, if you were to hire an EA, if someone came to you with a CV that said they had a master's in enterprise architecture, would that make them more or less appealing as a hire? No, you can give that a one-word answer because I've got to follow up.
I've probably hired somebody like that, and they did some reasonably good work, but didn't last all that long for cultural and other reasons.
Fine. Yep.
You see, but somebody with an OpenCA who's got the practical experience would be interesting because they've been evaluated by their peers.
That's right. And so that was going to be my second one, is if you then had an organically, dare I say, promoted EA, so whether it was one of your developers from the bunker for 20 years, but anyway, someone who was in the position, does someone like BNP Paribas pay for people to go off and do a master's in enterprise architecture? Is that, that kind of educational side of things? Have you seen that to be worthwhile, or is it better just to get on-the-job training and, as you say, understand the culture and the right personality will work it out rather than any formal training per se?
Well, it's difficult. I'm sure there's a place for all of that, to be honest. Although, speaking from first-hand experience here, I've not really seen that. I mean, they have very good in training internally. I mean, a master's, a very academic certification or qualification has some value. I mean, everyone who applies has a TOGAF certification, but even that means different things.
Yeah,
so
interesting.
Definitely people who have the experience, and that's what you need to gauge and be able to assess at the time of the interviews. And then focusing on the soft skills, how are they going to fit culturally, how they're going to network, will they get to know people, will they be able to sell their ideas? Always been the area that I would focus on most heavily.
No, great.
It's almost as if TOGAF and Archimate are tickets to entry. It's not something which is you need to have it. Almost as a de facto requirement. It's the experience.
No, which is, as you say, Stuart, is the open CA. Yeah, the open CA way of as you say, it's real life. Dare I say, scars. One of the things that I remember identifying quite early, if we talk personality profiles or anything like that, one of the prereqs we identified quite early was to be a good architect, you have to have failed before. Right.
Yeah,
by that, means you have to have been involved in things that have done it the wrong way and learnt the pain. You've got your scars, right? Learnt the pain of what happens when you don't do it the right way. So that's about the only thing we identified was that's just experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. Every EA has to have tried to go too deep too quickly and failed, and realized the extent of the challenge, and then been much more selective about the sorts of battles they want to fight. I saw a question flash by, just to make a sort of closing comment on the role of technology in sort of the EA function. I think that's an interesting one. You've got the aspect of technology and technical innovation and leadership, but you've also got more standard things like technology standardization, rationalization, all that sort of thing. I mean, I think it's interesting. I've sort of put less and less value on the technology aspects of that over the years, partly because of prioritization of resources. But I'm not sure I really know the answer to that and what the right sort of approach to that is. But you need to decide as a practice what your role and mandate is going to be in that space. It's difficult because you can't be skilled up for, or at least resourced up to cover all of those different elements, at least in my experience.
Yeah. So I think we're probably at time, gentlemen. So it's been a great discussion. I've been loath to butt in. I'd like to continue. I guess the one topic we didn't cover, which Tim, we maybe could make the topic of a future webinar if the guys are amenable, is actually applying the technology into EA itself. So how can we apply this sort of disruptive technology actually to the practice?
No, there have been lots of questions about that. Dare I say, as a tool vendor, lots of people are sort of, I didn't want to take them because they were kind of, salesy kind of questions. But there's been lots of questions about, how does Abacus help you, juggle the innovation speed with the other side of the bimodal thing. So we can certainly address that in a future session if we need to.
Just on a closing comment from our side, we often lose the ability to unlearn. In other words, there are things that we need to kind of, well, actually we tried that and it just doesn't work, but we need to unlearn it. And then also, really getting back to the fundamentals. I think the concept of the Zachman framework with primitives and composites is so poorly understood that a lot of architects are really into design and not into architecture. And I think that's where we lose a lot of speed in our processes. Simply because of the fact that we don't apply the discipline of mass customization from primitive into design being composite. So that's to be my bob's worth as one of the key things we need to change.
Okay, well, I think we'll probably stop there. I'll hand back to Simon. Simon, are there any sort of closing comments you want to put in at this point?
No, that's great, guys. Thanks very much for your time. Excellent presentation, excellent event, and thank you everyone for attending. And of course, Tim, if you and your team have got further ideas for future events, please let us know. So at this point, I'll end today's presentation. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Great. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.